Welcome back, scholars. Today we're going to be discussing the work of William Faulkner. William Faulkner was actually a contemporary of Ernest Hemingway. Our story for the day came out around 1939. And whereas Hemingway was a minimalist, believed that less was more, Faulkner was quite the opposite. Our story today is a story about conflict. William Faulkner once said in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize that the only thing worth writing about is the struggle of the soul against itself. That is certainly the case with our protagonist here, young Sardi, who's about 10 years old. As I said, Hemingway was a minimalist. Faulkner, not so much. Listen to these first two sentences of the short story and get a sense of what I'm talking about. The store in which the justice of the peace's court was sitting smelled of cheese. The boy, crouched on his nail keg at the back of the crowded room, knew he smelled cheese and more. From where he sat, he could see the ranked shelves close packed with solid, squat, dynamic shapes of tin cans whose labels his stomach read, not from the lettering, which meant nothing to his mind, but from the scarlet devils and silver curve of fish. This, the cheese, which he knew he smelled the hermetic meat, and which his intestines believed he smelled, coming from the intermittent gusts, momentary and brief, between the other constant one. The smell and sense of just a little fear, mostly because of the despair and grief, the old, fierce pull of blood. Okay, there's a lot going on here. And what we can glean from this description is, first, Sardi is poor. His family is poor. These are essentially white trash farmers. They're Abner Snopes, the father, is a sharecropper, and Sardi, his 10-year-old son, has been called as a witness here in this court case. His father, of course, on trial for burning a barn. But what we know from this paragraph of the first sentence is, okay, they're hungry, they're poor, he's illiterate, and he has some serious family issues here, right? He has a strong sense of family, which Faulkner is quite subtly setting up the central conflict here. This sense just a little of fear, because mostly of the despair and grief of blood. Okay. And he goes on to talk about the justice of the peace as his father's enemy. Then he corrects himself. Our enemy. Our enemy. Right? Both. He's my father. Right? So now you have this sense here. You can tell by the dialogue itself that Sardi is in conflict with himself. He's arguing here. He has to correct himself. He says, this judge is the enemy. No, he's our enemy. He's our enemy. And so what happens is, Abner, who we learn has burned his neighbor's barn down. And why has he done this? Well, because his pig got out and trampled his neighbor's garden. Okay. And so his neighbor acted pretty kindly, right? He offered to help him out. Brought him a spool of pig wire so that he could, of pig wire so that he could fence his hog in and he wouldn't get loose. And so he brought him a spool of it. Second time around. Third time around, he came up with the spool still laying out there in the yard, and he says, "Look, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you $1 to get your hog back." And so he sent the $1 with, and as the text said, a nigger. Now, this story was written in 1939. That word which is such a pejorative, such a hideous word today, was perfectly acceptable in Faulkner's day. And in the setting of the story, in the years just after the Civil War, we know Abner Snopes and his family, they're sharecroppers. They don't own property of their own. They live off someone else's land and work it and make their living planting somebody else's garden and harvesting it. Okay. But he had sent this fellow, this stranger, to the man's house and tell him with $1 and told him that hay and wood can burn. Right? warning. And next thing you know, the man's barn burns down. He's able to get his stock out, but the barn is lost. And so that's what brings us here. That's why Sardi and the rest are in front of the Justice of the Peace. And he says, the Justice of the Peace, he looks at him, and he's a kindly fella. Sardi can't see this, though. Right? Partially because maybe the dim light of the general store, and partially because of his internal noise. Right? He said, this man is my father's enemy. He's terribly conflicted. And so he steps up and he asks him, okay, what's your name, son? He says, Colonel Sartorius Snopes. Eh? So we know that the Justice of the Peace is a little bit hard of hearing. Yeah. And so he's trying to be kind to him, and he says kindly, he says, well, I guess anybody named Colonel Sartorius Snopes can't help but tell the truth. Now, the Snopes family, they appear in a lot of Faulkner's stories in the fictional Yakima-Patawpha County. And so he steps up there, and Mr. Harris, the plaintiff here, who's brought the court case against Abner, says, well, this is what happened, and this is what all went on. This is something my barn burned here. So I believe he did it. But this is all hearsay. He has no witness. And so they call Sardi here on the left. This is from, by the way, you can go on YouTube and find a late 60s, early 70s production of barn burning with the great Tommy Lee Jones. It is not a great production, but of course Tommy Lee Jones is the standout performance. But, you know, for educational purposes, you might want to take a look. Just dig it up on YouTube there. But anyway, he calls him up there, and he says, and he looks at the boy, and he was about 10 years old. This just innocent young kid standing there. And he says, turns to Mr. Harris, he goes, do you really want me to question him? To which he says, damnation, send him out of here. No, damnation, send him out of here. And now the fluid would rush beneath him, and the voices coming to him again, the smell of cheese and the sealed meat, and the fear and despair and the grief of blood. All right. So the way Faulkner describes it, when Sardi is called up there, he feels like he's swung on a grapevine out over a ravine, like you would do when you were a kid. In the days before technology and swing sets and playgrounds, you would invent your fun where you could. And so there's that sense of excitement when you swing out there and you reach the apex of your arc, and you're hanging out there in space and time. And this, when he was up there on the stand, this just kind of went on and on and on until Mr. Harris said no, and then that rush that that Faulkner describes, was when he was so told he could go away, he could step down from the stand. And so the Justice of the Peace tells him, well, listen, I can't find against you, this case is dismissed, but I can give you some advice. Well, he said, you and your family need to get out of town as quick as can. And Abner, the first time he speaks, and the first thing we hear of his character, he says, well, I'm not going to stay in a place populated with ... All right. Now, why would he say this? Well, he's already said the N-word repeatedly. Well, because the N-word wasn't necessarily that shocking during the day. Right? So what he did here is he puts what Abner says under ellipses. Yeah. It is a sort of authorial trick. This is why in Hemingway, a lot of times, Hemingway peppered his manuscripts with profanities, because that was how people talked. He wanted to be realistic. But his editors wouldn't do it, so you'll occasionally see things in Hemingway where he says, obscenity unprintable. That's literally what it says. Yeah. As a kind of a way of getting back at his editors and their standards. Anyway, so that is the trick here. This is Faulkner saying, he said something really vile and disgusting, but I can't tell you. So it leaves it up, which is in some ways worse because the author leaves it to your imagination what he said. So the justice of the peace says, that'll do. And so they head out. And notice the detail here, which is a very important part of the story, is Abner is dressed in his black Sunday coat, which is, formal. Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, as it were. Not for court, but for traveling. And later on he'll describe it as a burlesque. That it is that he's dressed for a sort of ritual violence. They're dressed in the same coat. And Sardi follows this coat here, which is a great detail there. It tells you a lot about the relationship here between Sardi and his father. It's this sort of authority figure. He follows this stiff black coat, and his father limps from being shot in the heel by a Confederate Army provost, which is essentially military police back in the day. And as they're heading out, there's something happens. Some kid from the gallery yells out or whispers, "Barn burner!" And so Sardi, with family loyalty, and this is very much a story about familial loyalty and the conflict therein, goes and takes off after the boy and starts fighting. He gets hit a couple of times. The kid gets up and runs off. And Sardi starts to get after him, and his father grabs him and says, "Get in the wagon." Now, the wagon is already loaded for leaving town. He's already decided on this. Okay? He said, and his mother starts to get out of the wagon because he's got blood on his face, and she's concerned about him. But Abner, who is a figure of inordinate authority and control, tells her to get back. Says, "Get back in the wagon." Here we go on the left. This is still frames from that public television production of the short film of barn burning. Tommy Lee Jones, the black coat there. And so they have already set off. They head out into the countryside, heading on to their next assignment, or their next sharecropping. And listen to this description by Faulkner of Abner. "There was something about his wolf-like independence and even courage, when the advantage was at least neutral, which impressed strangers, as if they got from his latent ravening ferocity not so much a sense of dependability as a feeling that his ferocious conviction was in the rightness of his own actions would be of advantage to all whose interest lay with him." Okay? Think about that. He has this sort of sense about him that whatever he does is the right thing. No sense that he questions it. And this brings about a sense of admiration in those around him. But we'll find that Abner is kind of, it's hard to describe. Maybe he's a bit of a sociopath. He strikes the mules and to get them going savagely, but there's no anger to it, no heat. It's just a matter of getting them on the way. And we learn that he went off to the Civil War as a sort of a mercenary. He says, they reveal this when they camp in a grove of oaks, and he builds this small little fire, and he refers to it as a small fire, neat, niggard almost, shrewd fire. Such fires were his father's habit, custom always in freezing weather. Older the boy might have remarked and wondered why not a big one. Why should not a man who had not only seen the waste of extravagance of war, but who had in his own blood an inherent voracious prodigality with material not his own. Okay, the word niggard, Niggard, means small, means cheap, tiny. So he said, even in cold weather, his father had been used to building these kind of fires. Why is that? Well, that's because Well, whose wood is he using? Not his own. These small fires were harder to see. Right? And even though it was cold out there, he builds this small fire to keep from being seen and keep the family from being seen, because they're trespassing on somebody else's land, burning somebody else's wood. And we learned that he had gone off to war as sort of a merc, and not necessarily fighting for any side or the other, but he was essentially a horse thief. And that's how he initially got shot. He was taking horses from he would take horses from both Confederates and the Union. He would steal them. He called them his captured horses. Essentially, they were stolen. So the family gets out and he camps, and he calls Sardi to his side, and he comes and he says, "Come with me. I want to talk to you," like a father does sometimes. He says, "You were fixing to tell them. You would have told him." He didn't answer. His father struck him with the flat of the hand on the side of the head, hard but without heat, exactly as he'd struck the two mules at the store, exactly as he would strike either of them with any stick in order to kill a horsefly. His voice still without heat or anger. "You're getting to be a man. You got to learn to stick to your own blood, or you ain't going to have any blood to stick to. Do you think them other men there this morning would? Don't you know that all they wanted was a chance to get at me because they knew I had them beat?" Later, years later, he was to tell himself, if I had said they only wanted truth and justice, he would have hit me again. But now he said nothing. He was not crying. He just stood there. "Answer me," his father said. "Yes," he whispered, and his father turned. "Get on to bed. We'll be there tomorrow." Okay. Again, this is very much a story about family. And in Snopes' and Abner's mind, there's family, then there's right and wrong. Right? We already have established that he has this sense of his rightness no matter what, that whatever he does and sees fit in his mind is what is the right thing to do. And it is Sardi's job to back him up simply because he's family. Now we got, Sardi and his two sisters who Faulkner refers to as bovine. These are big, chunky women. And then we have Sardi's brother. And then we have Abner and Sardi themselves, who are both thin and very wiry, small built men, or at least slim built men. And so they get to a place and they pull up and there's a shack there. And one of the sisters says, "This isn't fit for a hog to live in." He says, "Well, you're going to live in there. You're going to like it," essentially. And so the family starts unloading. And he brings Sardi with him. He says, "Sardi, you come with me. I'm aimed to go and meet the man that plans to own me, body and soul." He's going to see his employer, basically. But his attitude there, the way he expresses it, you have this sense of anger and kind of resentment at his station in life, right? At his economic position. And there's a little bit of resistance and rebellion to Abner. And so they start walking up the road, and now up until now they've worked for only small farmers and small farms, which is partially what has allowed Abner to act the way he has. Now, keep in mind, too, they have moved 12 times, 12 different locations, 12 different postings. Sardi's only 10 years old. Right? So that's on average more than once a year for him. And so they're walking up the road, and Sardi is amazed at the house. So Major Despain, the guy who owns the land that Abner is going to be sharecropping on, is quite wealthy. And you get a sense of that. You can see it from the size of it. Sardi says, "This place is as big as a courthouse." He's amazed. astounded at how large this place is. And he gets this sense of relief, this kind of peace that comes over him. And he has this feeling, his belief is that these folks will be protected from Abner's wrath. That it's just too big, that he'll be safe from it. There's no way that he would come and burn their barn. Maybe this time around, something will be different. Maybe they'll get to stay for a while. And so we see Abner walking up the road and steps right in the middle of horse manure. And Sardi's watching this and he's thinking, if he just moved to the left or the right just a little bit, he'll miss it. But no, not Abner. This tells us who Abner is. Abner is a rebel, not only against his employers, but the world at large, against common decency and the things that other people value. And so they come up the stairs, and there is a Negro servant, a butler there. And he opens the door in such a way that you can tell that he'd been watching. And he says to Abner, "White man, wipe your feet." Okay. Now, what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that he is, Abner is at the bottom of the social strata, and the butler is a little bit higher in society, in the rank there. And again, Abner resents this. He resents that he is the lowest of the low class. The butler, in his own fashion, represents a higher strata, a higher station in society. He's employed. He works in the house, and he just shoves the butler out of the way. He says, "Get out of my way." And he walks in and leaves his hat on. Okay. Now note these details. He leaves his hat on, and he comes in and stomps across her beautiful French rug, imported from Paris, with his nasty boots on, with the horse droppings on the heel. Now, my grandparents had cows when I was a kid. I used to go to the barn. One thing you did not do is come in the house from the barn without stomping and wiping your feet off first. Abner has no problem with this. He just walks right on in. And so the butler starts yelling, "Miss Lula, Miss Lula." And she comes out and is just flabbergasted to see this man limping into her nice, clean area with her husband away. He goes, "Go away, my husband is not here." You don't do that. You don't come to call on a lady without whose husband is away. It's the appearance of impropriety, it's rude, and it violates society's rules. Abner, again, this is just Faulkner describing Abner as a sort of a wolf, a ravenous wolf cast out from society. Now, what do we know about wolves? Wolves travel in packs. Abner has no pack other than his family. So he's been rejected by society at large. And so, rather than turning around and just walking off, he drags his nasty heel across the rug and heads right back out. And he looks up at the house and he remarks about it. And he says, that's nigger sweat, the N-word. That's nigger sweat. I mean, imagine, so I guess they're going to mix some white sweat with it, too, talking about his position and the work he's going to be doing on the place. Yeah. Wow. Not a likable guy, right? And Sardi here is horrified by this, but at the same time, there's not so much he can do because this is his dad. And so, excuse me. Major Despain comes home, comes riding up, and has the rugs slung over his saddle. He goes, "You're going to have to clean that. I want it back the way it was before you came stomping in." And so then he rides off. And so Abner's wife says, "Abner, please let me do it." "How well do you think that's going to work out?" Abner says, No, I'll take care of it. You take care of dinner." So he has the kids bring out the big cauldron, the big wash pot out there. It starts boiling, puts it over the fire, and starts boiling water. And then he brings in lye soap. What do we know about lye soap? Lye is acid. And rather than letting the women attend to it, who would be more adept at this, he takes it and he beats it out and scrapes it out, scrapes out the stain, returns it to Major Despain's house in an awful condition. Once again, Major Despain returns and he says, you ruined that rug. Look, that rug came from Paris. It cost $100. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to charge you 20 bushels of corn over what you normally, over your contract there, to make up for this. Still a pretty good deal. Now, the corn and what after what he raises for Major Despain, the corn and all of the food that he raises just to keep for himself, that's his livelihood. So, this is going to be an inconvenience to him, at the very least. Major Despain says, didn't you have any women who could take care of this? You could have easily restored it to the way it was, but it's not the way it was now. So you're gonna have to pay me extra. Once Major Despain leaves again, we have Sardi again coming to the defense of his father. He says, "Pap," he says. His father looked at him with an inscrutable face, the shaggy brows beneath which the gray eyes glinted coldly. Suddenly the boy went toward him fast, stopping suddenly. "You done the best you could," he cried. If he wanted it done differently, why didn't he wait and tell you how? He won't get 20 bushels. He won't get none. We'll gather it and hide it. I can watch. Did you put the cutter back in that straight stock like I told you? No, sir, he said. Then go do it. So here we have Sardi, knowing his father did wrong, still defending him and saying, making excuses for him. Well, hey, if he wanted it done differently, he should have told you. It's not fair. He won't get 20 bushels. We'll hide the corn. I'll watch. Abner's only reaction to this, to his son's outpouring of love and support, is, did you do what I told you? Did you put that tool up? No, sir. Then go do it. Right? Whatever else Abner exudes, there doesn't seem to be any expression of love coming Sardi's way here. And yet Sardi has this incredible loyalty and kindness to his father. He looks at her in the way that a son often. So Sardi begins to think, well, maybe things are going to work out. Time goes by, the incident isn't forgotten, but it's less painful than it was. And he thinks, well, maybe things will be all right. Maybe it'll be done with. And then the next scene, we're in a courtroom again, and the Abner and Sardi are there, and Major Despain are there, mostly shocked because he's being sued by one of his own tenants here. And what has happened is Abner has brought him into court to try to get out of giving him the extra corn. Yeah. And so, it says, when he saw a man in the spectacles sitting at the plank table, he did not need to be told that it was justice of the peace. He sent one glare of fierce, exultant, partisan defiance at the man in the collar and cravat, whom he had seen but twice before in his life, and that was on a galloping horse, who now wore on his face an expression not of rage, but of amazed unbelief, which the boy could not have known was the incredible circumstance of being sued by one of his tenants, right, Major Despain, and came and stood against his father and cried at the justice of the peace, "He ain't done it. He ain't burnt. Go back to the wagon," his father said. Sardi here is taking up for his father and telling the justice of the peace, he didn't do it. He didn't burn Major Despain's barn down. Well, he hadn't done it yet. He hasn't caused any issues here other than the rug. And then I said, "Burnt," said the justice of the peace. "Do I understand the rug was burned too?" Does anybody claim it was? The father said. "Go back to the wagon." But Sardi doesn't. He goes hides in the back, filters into the crowd, ends up in the back of the courtroom. And so he says, and you claim 20 bushels of corn is too high for the damage you did to the rug? He says, he brought me the rug and said he wanted the tracks washed out of it, and I washed the tracks out of it and took the rug back to him. But you didn't carry it back to him in the same condition it was in before he made the tracks on it. His father did not answer. Now, perhaps half a minute, there was no sound at all, save for the breathing and the faint, steady suspiration of complete and intent listening. You decline to answer, Mr. Snopes? And again the father did not answer. I'm going to find against you, Mr. Snopes. I'm going to find that you were responsible for the injury to Major Despain's rug and hold you liable for it. But 20 bushels of corn is a little high for a man who, in your circumstances, to have to pay. Major Despain claims that it cost $100. October corn will be worth about 50 cents. I figure Major Despain could stand a $95 loss on something he had paid cash for. And you can stand a $5 loss you haven't earned yet. I hold you in damages to Major Despain in the amount of 10 bushels of corn over and above your contract to him to be paid to him out of your crop gathering time. Court adjourned. Now this is a really fair deal. Instead of paying, I guess it'd be $10. He will be paying Major Despain $5 in the amount of corn that he's going to have to give forfeit. Right? Major Despain is still kind of wronged here. Right? He's got a ruined rug and $95 poorer as a result of it. You'd think Abner would be happy with this. You'd think this would be plenty fair. And this is not the case. Sardi again throwing an unprecedented amount of loyalty and support to his father. Says he won't get 5 bushels. He won't get none. We'll hide it. And his father goes, you think so? Well, maybe we'll see come October. And then Abner does something kind of unusual for him. He goes in the store and he buys cheese and crackers and divides them among Sardi and his son. And they dine. And they're breaking bread together the way a family would. And then they get back home, and Sardi is tasked with putting away the tack and the mule and all that. And then he hears his mother saying, Abner, no, no, no. Okay. One of the characters in here that we don't really probably think about so much because she is a kind of a static character is Sardi's mother. She has had to move 12 times throughout Sardi's life and over the last 10 years. And a lot of that probably with Sardi as an infant and a toddler. And this poor woman probably only wants peace, only wants some stability, which he will not get with Abner Snopes. Okay. And Abner has decided to do what Abner does. So he sends Sardi out and he tells him to go get the oil they were using to oil the wagon. And he pours it up in a can. And Sardi here, his moral conscience, his familial loyalty is starting to come into conflict with his moral compass. And he says, aren't you going to send a nigger? Aren't you going to send a messenger to let him know ahead of time? And he tells his son says, you're going to have to tie him because he knows that Sardi's not on board with this. He's going to run and warn Major Despain. And so they do. And they set off. Abner and his other son, set off to the Despains. Well, Sardi, finally overcoming the burden of family and seeking to do what is right and what is just, runs and goes to warn Major Despain. And he catches up there. He gets there and he's yelling, and Despain comes out and he says, Barn, your barn, Major Despain. Tell Despain the barn's going to burn. And they try to catch him up, but he runs off and he flees from the scene. And he says, he had thought before, I can just keep on running. I don't have to go and get the stuff. I can go out and instead of going out and getting the oil, I can just keep going. And now when he sees his father's plan starting to come to fruition, he does what he knows to be right. So he runs away, and in the distance he hears yelling, and then he hears 2 shots. And it doesn't, well, we don't have to have it spelled out to us what happened here. We know that Abner and Sardi's brother are dead. Faulkner writes, blotting the stars, and he saw springing up into the road again and running again, knowing it was too late, yet still running, even after he heard the shot, and an instant later 2 shots, pausing now, without knowing that he had ceased to run, crying, "Pap! Pap!" and running again. Before he knew he had begun to run, stumbling, tripping over something, and scrabbling up again without ceasing to run, looking back over his shoulder at the glare that he got up running among the invisible trees, panting, sobbing, "Father! Father!" At midnight, he was on a hill, the crest of a hill, and he did not know it was midnight, and he did not know how far he had come. But there was no glare behind him. Now he sat with his back toward what he had called home for 4 days anyhow, and his face towards the dark, which he would enter when breath was strong again, small, shaking steadily in the chill darkness, hugging himself to the remainder of his thin, rotten shirt. And the grief and despair, now no longer terror and fear, but just grief and despair. Father, my father, he thought. He was brave, he cried suddenly, aloud, but not loud, no more than a whisper. He was in the war. He was in Colonel Sartoris's cavalry. And here we have the narrator undercutting us here. He says, not knowing that his father had gone to that war in the fine European sense, wearing no uniform, admitting the authority of and giving fidelity to no man or no army or flag, going to war as Malbrook himself did, for booty. It meant nothing and less than nothing to him if it were enemy booty or his own. So here we go. We have one of the most powerful things about this story is the fact that Faulkner reiterates sometimes doing the right thing is costly and painful, and doing the right thing is not always the best thing for you, but it's still the right thing. This is what Sardi does. He finally resolves the conflict between his familial ties and his moral compass, and it costs him. And the last lines of the story says, he went down the hill toward the dark woods within which the liquid silver voice of the birds called unceasing, the rapid and urging beating of urgent and inquiring heart of the late spring. He did not look back. Okay. And Sardi never appears again in any of Faulkner's works. The synopses are peppered throughout, but this is the last we see of Sardi. Why does he go into the woods? Because that is the new beginning. Because he is breaking the family tie, the bond of blood that had tugged at him and held him for so long. Okay, a lot packed into a few short pages here. Quite a dramatic story. One of my favorite Faulkner stories here, barn burning. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and as so much as you can enjoy such a bleak story. But the key takeaway here is the conflict of the soul with itself. Sardi doing battle with what he knows to be right versus his family ties. Anyway, that's barn burning, and I'll see you in the next video.